North America's recorded history begins with sustained written documentation from European explorers, settlers, and chroniclers. While indigenous peoples had lived on the continent for tens of thousands of years, their histories were mainly oral. The arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century made the first enduring records of North America's geography, societies, and peoples. From this point onward, a detailed chronological account of the continent becomes possible, revealing the complex interactions between indigenous civilizations, European powers, and, later, African populations through the transatlantic slave trade. This North American documentary begins in 1492, a turning point that marked the start of North America's recorded history, and traces the foundations of European exploration, settlement, and the initial documentation of indigenous societies. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown of Ferdinand and Isabella, reached the islands of the Caribbean, believing he had found a western route to Asia. His first landfall was on an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. Columbus's journals, letters, and reports form the earliest sustained European record of the Americas. Over his subsequent voyages in 1493, 1498, and 1502, Columbus explored additional Caribbean islands, including Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, laying the foundation for European colonization. Although Columbus did not reach the continental mainland on these voyages, his expeditions spurred Spain to fund further exploration and conquest. Spanish navigators charted coastlines, rivers, and islands, producing some of the earliest detailed maps of North America. By 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon had reached the east coast of Florida, naming it La Florida during his search for gold and the fabled Fountain of Youth. Ponce de Leon's expedition documented interactions with local indigenous groups, including the Calusa and Tequesta peoples, recording elements of their society, settlements, and resistance to European incursion. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed in what is now Mexico, beginning the campaign against the Aztec Empire. Cortés's conquest, completed in 1521, was facilitated by alliances with indigenous groups who opposed Aztec rule, as well as by European diseases such as smallpox, which devastated native populations. The fall of Tenochtitlan was recorded in letters by Cortés and other Spanish chroniclers, providing detailed accounts of Aztec society, political organization, and culture. These documents became critical primary sources for early North American history. Spanish expansion continued throughout the Caribbean, Mexico, and into the southern regions of what is now the United States. In the late 1530s, Hernando de Soto led an expedition across the southeastern United States, including present-day Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, mapping rivers and documenting the societies of Mississippian culture towns. De Soto's chronicles include observations of mound-building societies, such as the Cadone Mississippians, who constructed ceremonial earthworks and organized complex chiefdoms. These accounts provide some of the first recorded interactions between Europeans and the diverse indigenous nations of North America. By 1565, Spain established St. Augustine in present-day Florida, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. Founded by Pedro Menendez de Aviles, St. Augustine served as a strategic military outpost and administrative center for Spanish Florida. The settlement was also a hub for missions intended to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, including the Timucua and Apalachee communities. Mission records from this period document indigenous labor, social organization, and cultural practices, offering an additional layer to early North American recorded history. Spanish expeditions extended westward into the American Southwest. In the late 1590s, Juan de Oñate led settlers from New Spain into present-day New Mexico, establishing the colony of Santa Fe. Oñate's chronicles detail encounters with the Pueblo peoples, including the Acoma, Zuni, and Hopi, documenting their villages, religious practices, and agricultural systems. These accounts also include records of resistance, such as the Acoma Pueblo Revolt of 1599, in which Oñate's forces suppressed a local uprising with significant casualties. Such interactions highlight the often violent dynamics of early European colonization. While Spain dominated exploration in the south and west, the French and English began their own expeditions at the turn of the 16th century. French explorers, including Giovanni de Verrazzano in 1524, charted the Atlantic coast from present-day North Carolina to Newfoundland. Verrazzano's maps and letters recorded indigenous populations and trade networks along the coast. In the 1530s and 1540s, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River, establishing France's earliest claims in what would become Canada. Cartier's writings include descriptions of the St. Lawrence Iroquoian peoples, their villages, agriculture, and political structures. The period between 1492 and 1600 also saw the earliest European introduction of African slaves to North America. Spain and Portugal had already begun importing enslaved Africans to their Caribbean colonies in the early 16th century. By the late 1500s, African labor was increasingly used on plantations and in mining operations in the Caribbean and New Spain, laying the groundwork for the transatlantic slave trade that would expand in the 17th century. These records provide insights into the forced migration of Africans and their contributions to colonial economies. During this period, indigenous populations were dramatically affected by European contact. Diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles spread rapidly, causing mortality rates estimated at 50 to 90% in some communities. Europeans documented not only the population declines, but also the social, political, and economic disruptions these epidemics caused, including the collapse of trade networks and shifts in settlement patterns. Despite the devastation, many indigenous societies, such as the Pueblo and Mississippian peoples, continued to maintain complex agricultural and political systems, which were recorded by both European chroniclers and missionaries. By the end of the 16th century, the foundations for North America's recorded history were firmly established. European powers, primarily Spain, had mapped coastlines, established settlements, chronicled indigenous cultures, and initiated economic and military systems that would define colonial North America. Missionaries, conquistadors, and explorers left detailed accounts of geography, society, and early intercultural interactions, creating the first extensive written record of the continent. These records would later inform both colonial administration and historical scholarship. In 1607, the English established Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the region. Sponsored by the Virginia Company, Jamestown's settlers initially struggled with food shortages, disease, and conflicts with indigenous groups. The Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful coalition of Algonquian-speaking nations, controlled much of the surrounding territory and engaged in both trade and intermittent warfare with the settlers. Early records, including Captain John Smith's writings, document the complex interactions between the English and the Powhatan peoples, including exchanges of corn, guidance on local agriculture, and sporadic violent confrontations. Jamestown's survival depended on adaptation to the environment, alliances with local indigenous groups, and the development of cash crops, primarily tobacco, which became Virginia's first profitable export by the 1620s. In 1608, the French established Quebec under the leadership of Samuel de Champlain. Quebec became the administrative and military center of New France, strategically positioned along the St. Lawrence River. Champlain's journals describe interactions with the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, Huron-Wendat, and Algonquin peoples. French colonial strategy relied heavily on alliances with indigenous nations, particularly for fur trading networks. By the early 17th century, the fur trade, especially beaver pelts, became a central economic activity, involving both indigenous trappers and European traders. French settlements in Canada were relatively small but strategically placed, with an emphasis on missionary activity, trade, and military presence rather than large-scale settlement. The Dutch established New Amsterdam in 1624 on Manhattan Island, part of the colony of New Netherland. Dutch settlements were smaller than their English and Spanish counterparts, but were notable for their mercantile focus, particularly in fur trading. Dutch West India Company records describe the establishment of forts, trading posts, and interactions with the Lenape and Mahican peoples. New Amsterdam became a hub of commercial activity, attracting settlers of diverse European origins, including Dutch, German, and Scandinavian migrants, along with enslaved Africans, who were first recorded in the colony in 1625. The colony emphasized trade, pragmatic alliances with indigenous nations, and the cultivation of agriculture to support local populations. Throughout the 17th century, European colonization in North America introduced the transatlantic slave trade. The first documented arrival of enslaved Africans in the English colonies occurred in 1619 at Jamestown, when a Dutch privateer delivered 20 enslaved individuals from Africa. Spain and Portugal had already been transporting enslaved Africans to their Caribbean and New Spain colonies since the early 1500s. By the mid-1600s, African slavery became integral to the labor systems in the southern English colonies, particularly in tobacco cultivation in Virginia and Maryland. Records from colonial administrators, merchants, and plantation owners provide detailed accounts of the numbers, origins, and labor assignments of enslaved Africans. These records illustrate the foundational role of African labor in the economic development of North America during the colonial period. Indigenous populations experienced significant disruption during early colonization. Diseases, particularly smallpox, measles, and influenza, spread rapidly among populations with no prior immunity, resulting in estimated mortality rates of 50 to 90% in some communities. European chroniclers, including John Smith and Jesuit missionaries in New France, documented these epidemics, noting depopulation, social dislocation, and the collapse of some indigenous political systems. Despite these challenges, many indigenous nations adapted to the new colonial environment, engaging in trade, forming strategic alliances, and sometimes participating in European conflicts as auxiliary forces. Spanish settlements continued to expand in the southern and western regions of North America. Missions and presidios were established in Florida, New Mexico, and Texas during the early 1600s. Spanish colonial administration, including the encomienda and repartimiento systems, recorded indigenous labor obligations, tribute, and cultural assimilation efforts. Missionaries documented religious instruction, agricultural techniques, and community organization among the Timucua, Pueblo, and other indigenous groups. By the mid-1600s, the Spanish colonial network extended from Mexico City northward into present-day New Mexico and Arizona, combining religious, military, and administrative functions to maintain control over large territories with relatively sparse European populations. French and English expansion in the northern Atlantic region relied heavily on alliances with indigenous nations for survival and economic growth. In New France, the fur trade depended on indigenous trapping expertise, and French settlements such as Trois-Rivières and Montreal were strategically located to facilitate both trade and military operations. Champlain's writings from the 1610s and 1620s emphasize cooperation with the Huron-Wendat for mutual defense against the Iroquois Confederacy, highlighting how European colonial ambitions were often intertwined with indigenous political dynamics. English colonists in New England, including Plymouth, 1620, and Massachusetts Bay, 1630, documented interactions with the Wampanoag, Pequot, and Narragansett peoples. These records include descriptions of diplomacy, trade, and periodic violent conflicts, culminating in events such as the Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, in which European and indigenous forces engaged in organized military campaigns. By the late 1600s, colonies along the Atlantic seaboard had expanded significantly. In New England, settlements were clustered along coastal areas and navigable rivers, facilitating trade and communication. Population records from the 1670s indicate that the English colonies collectively housed approximately 250,000 people, including European settlers, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. Trade networks connected North America with Europe and Africa, exporting tobacco, fish, timber, and furs, while importing manufactured goods, firearms, and enslaved labor. The Dutch colony of New Netherland maintained a smaller population but served as a commercial nexus, integrating fur trade, agriculture, and international shipping. Religious motives were a defining element of colonization. Spanish missions sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, documenting religious practices, community organization, and resistance. French Jesuit missionaries in Canada produced extensive records of Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, and Iroquoian belief systems, language, and social structures. English Puritan settlements in New England combined religious governance with civic administration, creating detailed records of town meetings, church membership, and social order. These documents provide historians with insight into the early ideological frameworks that shaped colonial societies and their interactions with indigenous populations. Conflicts over land, resources, and political control emerged as colonies matured. The English Powhatan Wars, 1610 to 1646, in Virginia illustrate sustained military engagements between European settlers and indigenous confederacies. In New England, the Pequot War and subsequent King Philip's War in the late 17th century reflected tensions arising from expansion, settlement encroachment, and competing economic interests. French and Dutch records describe similar conflicts, emphasizing the strategic importance of alliances with indigenous nations to secure trade routes and territorial claims. By the end of the 17th century, colonial governance structures were increasingly formalized. English colonies operated under royal charters or proprietary governance, with assemblies and councils documenting legislation, taxation, and disputes. French colonies maintained centralized administration through governors and intendant systems, while Dutch settlements were overseen by the Dutch West India Company. Spanish colonies were administered through viceroyalties, with local governors and military officers responsible for maintaining order, implementing laws, and overseeing indigenous labor. These administrative records constitute a substantial portion of North America's written history for this period. Economic development in the colonies was closely tied to geography and climate. In the southern colonies, plantations focused on tobacco, rice, and indigo, relying on enslaved African labor. In New England, shipbuilding, fishing, and small-scale agriculture dominated the economy, supplemented by trade with Europe and the Caribbean. The middle colonies, such as New York and Pennsylvania, developed mixed economies of grain cultivation, trade, and craft production. French colonies focused on fur trading, supplemented by small-scale agriculture and missionary work. Quantitative records indicate that by 1700, the European population in North America reached approximately 250,000 to 300,000, while indigenous populations continued to decline due to disease and displacement. This period also saw the introduction of European legal, social, and cultural practices. Spanish, English, French, and Dutch colonists established courts, property laws, and taxation systems that were documented extensively. Missionary records, travel accounts, and official correspondence describe daily life, settlement patterns, and interactions with indigenous and African populations. These writings provide detailed insight into the political, economic, and social organization of early North American colonies and form the backbone of the continent's recorded history from 1600 to 1700. In addition to settlement and trade, European colonists introduced new agricultural practices, livestock, and crops, which were recorded in journals and official reports. The introduction of wheat, sugar, cattle, horses, and pigs transformed the landscape and indigenous agricultural systems. Mission and colonial administrators documented land use, crop yields, and ecological changes, offering quantitative evidence of the environmental impact of colonization. By 1700, North America's recorded history was firmly established across multiple regions and powers. English, French, Dutch, and Spanish records collectively documented settlement patterns, indigenous societies, economic development, and transatlantic connections. These documents include detailed accounts of population numbers, conflicts, trade networks, religious practices, and governance systems, providing a comprehensive written record of the continent's early colonial era. Indigenous societies, despite population decline and territorial loss, remained central to colonial economies and diplomacy, and their interactions with Europeans were extensively chronicled, forming a critical component of North America's historical record. At the start of the 18th century, the English colonies along the Atlantic coast were growing both in population and territorial extent. By 1700, the English colonies numbered 13 along the eastern seaboard, including Virginia, Massachusetts Bay, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and the Carolinas. Population estimates indicate that approximately 250,000 English settlers resided in these colonies, along with 20,000 Africans brought through the transatlantic slave trade. Indigenous populations continued to decline due to the spread of European diseases, land encroachment, and violent conflict. Despite these challenges, many indigenous nations, including the Powhatan Confederacy, Wampanoag, Pequot, and Iroquois Confederacy, maintained control of substantial territories, influencing trade and military alliances. French settlements in North America were concentrated in Canada along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes region, and the Mississippi River Valley. By 1700, New France had a population of roughly 15,000 European settlers, supported by fur trade networks that relied on alliances with the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, and other indigenous nations. French colonists maintained smaller settlements than the English, but exerted considerable influence through trade and military cooperation. French Jesuit missionaries documented indigenous languages, customs, and religious practices, creating extensive records that form a critical component of North American recorded history for this period. The Spanish continued to consolidate control over Florida, Mexico, and the Southwest. Spanish missions expanded in New Mexico, Texas, and California, aiming to convert indigenous populations to Christianity and integrate them into colonial economies. Mission records from the early 1700s document the labor of Pueblo, Timucua, and other indigenous communities, agricultural production, and cultural assimilation efforts. In Florida, Spanish authorities maintained St. Augustine as a fortified military and administrative center, coordinating defense against English incursions from the Carolinas and French influence in the Gulf Coast. Territorial competition among European powers frequently escalated into military conflict. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, known in North America as Queen Anne's War, involved English, French, and Spanish forces along with indigenous allies. Battles occurred in New England, the southern colonies, and the Caribbean, with French and Spanish forces supporting indigenous allies in contested regions. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ended Queen Anne's War, ceding parts of Acadia, present-day Nova Scotia, to England, while maintaining French control over Newfoundland, Cape Breton, and other territories. This treaty reshaped colonial boundaries, creating new tensions between settlers and indigenous nations displaced by territorial shifts. During this period, the English colonies experienced significant economic expansion. In New England, the economy was based on small-scale agriculture, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade with Europe and the Caribbean. The Middle Colonies, including New York and Pennsylvania, developed mixed economies of grain production, artisanal craftwork, and commerce. In the Southern colonies, tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations expanded rapidly, relying heavily on enslaved African labor. Quantitative records indicate that by 1720, Virginia alone held approximately 20,000 enslaved Africans, representing roughly 30% of the colony's population. Plantation economies in South Carolina and Georgia grew in parallel, with enslaved populations forming the majority in certain regions. Indigenous populations in the southern and middle colonies faced increasing displacement due to settlement expansion. The Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast leveraged alliances with English and French powers to maintain influence, controlling trade routes and strategic territories. The Creek, Cherokee, and Choctaw in the southeast navigated European diplomacy, offering support in military campaigns in exchange for trade goods, firearms, and territorial recognition. Missionaries, colonial officials, and traders documented these interactions, providing detailed accounts of alliances, conflicts, and social change. The first half of the 18th century also saw the establishment of key cities and colonial centers. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston grew as commercial hubs, facilitating the export of goods such as tobacco, grain, timber, and fur to Europe. Dutch influence persisted in New York until 1664, when England formally annexed New Netherland, renaming it New York and consolidating control over the Mid-Atlantic region. The Dutch population largely integrated into the English administrative framework, but Dutch mercantile practices and cultural contributions continued to influence trade and governance. The mid-18th century was marked by heightened conflict between England and France over control of North America. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, part of the Global 7 Years' War, involved extensive military campaigns in the Ohio River Valley, Great Lakes region, and along the eastern seaboard. English forces, supported by colonial militias, fought against French troops and indigenous allies, including the Algonquin, Huron, and Ottawa nations. Key engagements included the Battle of Fort Necessity, 1754, the capture of Fort Duquesne, 1758, and the Battle of Quebec, 1759, which culminated in British victory. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded Canada and all territories east of the Mississippi River to England, while Spain ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana. This treaty fundamentally reconfigured North American political geography and increased tensions between English authorities and colonial settlers. Economic policies imposed by the British Crown following the French and Indian War contributed to growing dissatisfaction among colonists. Trade regulations, taxation, and land policies were documented in official proclamations, such as the Proclamation of 1763, which restricted settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists were required to adhere to mercantilist regulations, importing British goods and exporting raw materials to support the imperial economy. Colonial records detail complaints regarding the costs of enforcement, restrictions on westward expansion, and the presence of British troops in frontier regions. Indigenous nations continued to navigate European expansion through strategic alliances and resistance. The Pontiac Rebellion of 1763 illustrates organized resistance by native peoples in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions against British military and settler encroachment. Ottawa leader Pontiac coordinated attacks on British forts and settlements, prompting a military response that ultimately suppressed the rebellion but demonstrated Indigenous agency and strategic organization. Colonial and military records from this period provide detailed accounts of troop movements, fortifications, casualty numbers, and negotiation processes. The period between 1700 and 1775 also witnessed the growth of cultural, religious, and intellectual life in the colonies. Puritan influence persisted in New England, regulating education, church membership, and social order. Quaker communities in Pennsylvania promoted literacy, pacifism, and trade. French Catholic missions in Canada continued documenting Indigenous languages, beliefs, and social structures. English colonies codified laws, maintained records of town meetings, and regulated commerce through written ordinances. These administrative documents provide a comprehensive account of governance, social norms, and economic practices during this period. By the 1760s and early 1770s, the English colonies had experienced significant demographic and economic growth. Population estimates indicate that by 1770, the 13 colonies held approximately 2.1 million people of European descent, alongside 500,000 enslaved Africans and hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples, though their populations were declining due to displacement and disease. Trade networks linked colonies to Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa, exchanging commodities including tobacco, rice, indigo, lumber, furs, sugar, and manufactured goods. Colonial records detail taxation, tariffs, and export volumes, providing quantitative data on the economic foundations of the continent. Conflicts between European powers and indigenous nations, combined with growing colonial populations, set the stage for increased tension over land and governance. Settlers moving westward encroached on indigenous territories, prompting negotiations, treaties, and sporadic armed conflicts. Indigenous nations leveraged European rivalries to protect lands and influence trade, as seen in alliances with French or English forces during the French and Indian War. These alliances were documented through treaties, military reports, and diplomatic correspondence. By the eve of the American Revolution, the English colonies had developed a complex social, political, and economic structure. Colonial assemblies, town meetings, and mercantile networks were firmly established. Indigenous nations remained key actors in regional politics and trade. The policies implemented by the British Crown, particularly after 1763, created growing dissatisfaction among colonists, who documented grievances through petitions, pamphlets, and public protests. These records provide a detailed account of the factors leading to revolutionary sentiment, including taxation, territorial restrictions, and military presence. The American Revolutionary War began in April 1775, when colonial militias engaged British troops at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The conflict emerged from escalating tensions between the 13 English colonies and the British Crown, driven by disputes over taxation, governance, and representation. Colonial assemblies had repeatedly challenged British policies, such as the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, and the Tea Act of 1773, documenting grievances through petitions, public assemblies, and publications. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 exemplified colonial resistance and contributed to the escalation of military confrontation. In 1776, the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, formally asserting the colony's separation from Britain. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the document outlined political principles, grievances against the British Crown, and the colony's assertion of sovereignty. Following the declaration, the Revolutionary War spread across multiple theaters, including New England, the Mid-Atlantic, the Southern colonies, and frontier regions near the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley. Colonial forces, organized under the Continental Army, faced British regular troops and Loyalist militias. Leadership under George Washington coordinated campaigns that combined conventional military operations with militia engagements. Key battles include the Battle of Bunker Hill, 1775, the Saratoga Campaign, 1777, and the Siege of Yorktown, 1781. The French government, motivated by opposition to Britain and long-standing geopolitical interests, allied with the colonies in 1778, providing military aid, naval support, and financial resources. Spain and the Dutch Republic also contributed indirectly by engaging British forces in the Caribbean and Europe, creating global pressure on Britain. The war's conclusion came with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which recognized the United States as an independent nation and established borders extending to the Mississippi River in the west, the Great Lakes in the north, and Spanish Florida in the south. Loyalist populations, numbering tens of thousands, migrated to Canada, the Caribbean, and Britain, while indigenous nations faced territorial losses and diminished political influence due to their involvement in the war and subsequent treaties. The Iroquois Confederacy, which had largely allied with Britain, lost substantial territory, and records indicate significant displacement and resettlement in Canada and Western regions. Following independence, the United States faced the challenge of establishing governance structures. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, created a loose federal system with limited central authority, emphasizing state sovereignty. Early national records documented disputes over taxation, trade regulation, and Western land claims, revealing weaknesses in the Confederation framework. These challenges prompted the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which produced the United States Constitution, ratified in 1789. The Constitution established a federal government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches, codifying powers, responsibilities, and mechanisms for representation. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, enumerated fundamental civil liberties, including freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, and the rights of due process and fair trial. Westward expansion during this period was guided by policies such as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which created a framework for governance and settlement in territories northwest of the Ohio River. The ordinance established procedures for admission of new states, protections for civil liberties, and mechanisms for dealing with indigenous populations, land distribution, and economic development. Settlers from eastern states moved into the Ohio Valley, Kentucky, and Tennessee, documenting settlement patterns, land purchases, and conflicts with local indigenous nations, including the Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware. During this era, Spain continued to govern territories in Mexico, the Southwest, and Florida. Spanish administration maintained missions, presidios, and settlements, documenting interactions with Pueblo, Apache, and other indigenous communities. Spanish records from the late 18th century include census data, land grants, and reports on agricultural production, demonstrating attempts to consolidate control over sparsely populated northern frontier regions. Spain also engaged diplomatically with the United States over territorial claims, particularly concerning navigation rights on the Mississippi River, and access to the Gulf of Mexico, formalized in treaties such as Pinckney's Treaty of 1795. In Canada, British colonial administration continued to manage territories acquired after the French and Indian War, overseeing loyalist resettlement, the development of civil institutions, and trade regulation. Upper and Lower Canada were administratively defined in 1791, providing mechanisms for legislative representation and governance while maintaining allegiance to the British Crown. Records document population growth from Loyalist migration, expansion of agricultural settlements, and interactions with indigenous nations, including the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, who were granted land along the Grand River as part of treaty agreements. Economic developments in the newly independent United States were central to nation building. The post-war period saw the introduction of national currency, stabilization of credit, and creation of infrastructure for domestic and international trade. Records indicate the establishment of the first Bank of the United States in 1791, the regulation of tariffs to support domestic manufacturing, and commercial treaties with European nations to facilitate exports of tobacco, cotton, wheat, and other commodities. Shipbuilding, fishing, and transatlantic trade continued to provide economic foundations for the northern states, while the southern states relied on plantation agriculture and enslaved labor, particularly in the Chesapeake and Carolina regions. Indigenous relations during this period were marked by treaties, territorial negotiations, and conflicts. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 1784, and subsequent agreements attempted to define boundaries between settlers and indigenous nations in the Ohio Valley. Conflicts such as the Northwest Indian War, 1785 to 1795, arose as indigenous confederacies resisted settler encroachment, culminating in the Treaty of Greenville, 1795, which ceded large tracts of land to the United States while preserving limited territories for indigenous occupation. Records from both indigenous leaders and U.S. negotiators provide detailed accounts of land cessions, compensation, and the enforcement of territorial boundaries. The United States also acquired significant territories during this period. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, negotiated with France under Napoleon Bonaparte, doubled the size of the nation, extending boundaries westward to the Rocky Mountains. Detailed maps, land surveys, and exploration records document the geography, rivers, and indigenous populations of these territories. Exploratory expeditions, including those led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, 1804 to 1806, recorded interactions with numerous indigenous nations, documenting languages, cultural practices, natural resources, and settlement patterns, providing extensive primary material for North America's recorded history. Mexico underwent significant change during this period as well. Spanish colonial administration continued until the early 19th century, maintaining missions, cities, and governance structures. Local populations, including indigenous communities, mestizo settlers, and European-descended elites, were documented in censuses and administrative reports. Social hierarchies, land tenure systems, and taxation records illustrate the complex economic and political organization of northern New Spain, which would later transition into an independent nation in 1821. Military conflicts and diplomacy shaped the continental balance of power. The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain, lasting from 1812 to 1815, involved battles along the northern frontier, the Great Lakes, and coastal regions. U.S. forces, British troops, Canadian militias, and indigenous allies engaged in campaigns documented through military reports, casualty records, and correspondence. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 restored pre-war territorial boundaries but reinforced U.S. claims in the Northwest, while indigenous allies, such as those led by Tecumseh, faced territorial losses and diminished influence following the conflict. The post-war period saw the consolidation of federal authority and the expansion of internal infrastructure. Roads, canals, and port facilities were developed to support trade and communication between eastern states and western territories. Population records indicate continued growth, with the United States population reaching approximately 9.6 million by 1820, including nearly 1.5 million enslaved Africans. Northern states began gradual emancipation programs, while southern states expanded plantation economies, reinforcing regional economic distinctions documented in census data and legislative records. In addition to political and military developments, cultural and intellectual life grew during this period. Universities, schools, and religious institutions were documented across the colonies, providing education and social organization. Newspapers, pamphlets, and correspondence created a record of public discourse, political debate, and legal frameworks. These written materials offered detailed insight into daily life, governance, and societal priorities during the formation of the United States. By 1820, North America had entered a phase of established nationhood for the United States, ongoing colonial administration in Canada, and continued Spanish governance in Mexico. Settlements had expanded into Western territories. Indigenous populations had faced displacement and negotiated treaties, and economic systems were increasingly differentiated regionally. Records from this period provide a comprehensive account of the military, political, social, and economic foundations of the continent, laying the groundwork for further expansion, industrialization, and reform throughout the 19th century. In the United States, westward expansion was a central feature of this period. The ideology of manifest destiny, articulated during the 1840s, justified territorial growth, linking expansion to a sense of national purpose and economic opportunity. By 1820, the United States had approximately 9.6 million residents, concentrated along the eastern seaboard, the Ohio River Valley, and parts of the South. Census data indicate a continued demographic shift westward, as settlers moved into Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri, establishing farms, towns, and trade routes. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to balance the admission of free and slave states, maintaining a tenuous equilibrium between northern and southern regions, and providing early insight into the sectional conflicts that would intensify in subsequent decades. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 continued to influence settlement patterns in this period, as territories extending westward to the Rocky Mountains were gradually explored and organized. Land surveys, military expeditions, and settler reports documented the geography, waterways, and indigenous populations of these territories. Explorers and surveyors, including Zebulon Pike and Stephen H. Long, provided detailed accounts of the Great Plains, the upper Mississippi region, and areas along the Arkansas and Red Rivers. These records informed land distribution policies and facilitated settler migration into the Western territories. The southward and southwestern expansion of the United States intersected with Mexico, which had achieved independence from Spain in 1821. Mexican territories in the present-day American Southwest, including Texas, New Mexico, and California, experienced limited Spanish-style governance before independence. After 1821, Mexico encouraged settlement by foreign colonists, including Anglo-Americans, through land grants and impresario programs, particularly in Texas under Stephen F. Austin. These settlements introduced European-American agricultural practices, legal institutions, and trade networks, while creating tension with indigenous nations such as the Comanche, Apache, and Kiowa, who resisted encroachment on their traditional territories. Indigenous populations in the United States faced increasing displacement and removal during this period. Federal policies, codified in legislation such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830, authorized the relocation of indigenous nations from eastern territories to lands west of the Mississippi River. This process included the Trail of Tears, 1830s, during which the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations were forcibly removed from ancestral lands. Contemporary records, including government documents, military correspondence, and personal accounts, detail the logistical organization of these relocations, population losses, disease outbreaks, and resistance efforts. The removal policies consolidated U.S. control over fertile lands in the Southeast, facilitating plantation expansion and the entrenchment of the slave-based economy. Slavery remained a central component of the Southern economy. By the 1830s and 1840s, the cultivation of cotton, supported by enslaved African labor, dominated the southern United States. Plantation records, census data, and economic reports indicate that the enslaved population grew steadily, with concentrated numbers in states such as South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. The domestic slave trade, including forced migrations from the Upper South to the Deep South, contributed to the internal redistribution of enslaved populations, producing extensive documentation of economic transactions, family separations, and labor allocations. In contrast, northern states increasingly pursued industrial development and gradual emancipation, producing regional economic divergence that informed political debates. Northern industrialization progressed through the development of textile mills, ironworks, and transportation infrastructure. Canals, such as the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, facilitated the movement of goods and people between the interior and eastern seaboard ports. Railroads expanded significantly during the 1830s and 1840s, linking New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Midwest, and establishing networks that facilitated both commerce and migration. Economic records from banking institutions, manufacturing firms, and trade offices document capital investment, production volumes, and labor distribution, providing quantitative insight into the regional economic transformation. In the Northern Territories and along the Mississippi Valley, European-descended settlers established farms, towns, and trading posts, often negotiating or contesting indigenous land claims. Treaties with indigenous nations, including the Treaty of St. Louis, 1825, and subsequent agreements, transferred large tracts of land to the United States while providing limited compensation or reservation lands. Military campaigns and localized conflicts supplemented treaty making, documenting both settler expansion and indigenous resistance. The mid-19th century also witnessed the growth of political parties and governance structures. The Democratic Party and the Whig Party dominated U.S. politics during the 1820s, 1850s, with debates centered on territorial expansion, banking policies, tariffs, and the regulation of slavery. Congressional records, legislative acts, and electoral data illustrate the development of representative institutions, regional political interests, and the legislative frameworks that governed westward expansion, infrastructure investment, and social policies. Mexico, during this period, experienced political instability following independence from Spain. federal and centralist factions contested control, producing a series of constitutional reforms, military conflicts, and changes in governance. Key leaders included Agustin de Iturbide, who briefly declared himself emperor, and Antonio López de Santa Anna, who held multiple terms as president during periods of centralization and conflict. Mexican administrative records, censuses, and legal codes provide detailed insight into governance, land tenure, taxation, and interactions with indigenous populations. The northern provinces, particularly Texas, faced both demographic growth through Anglo-American settlement and ongoing indigenous resistance, creating a dynamic frontier environment. Relations between the United States and Mexico intensified during this period, culminating in tensions over the annexation of Texas in 1845. Before annexation, the Texas Revolution, 1835 to 1836, resulted in the establishment of the Republic of Texas, following military engagements such as the Battle of the Alamo, 1836, and the Battle of San Jacinto, 1836. Records from Texian and Mexican forces document troop movements, casualties, territorial claims, and diplomatic negotiations. The Republic of Texas maintained independence until its annexation by the United States, which contributed to broader continental conflict, including the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, which would follow in subsequent decades. The western territories of the United States, including areas of present-day California, Oregon, and Utah, experienced increasing settlement during this period. The migration of settlers along routes such as the Oregon Trail and the California Trail was documented in diaries, census reports, and military surveys. These movements facilitated trade, established townships, and created mechanisms for territorial governance. Indigenous populations, including the Shoshone, Nez Perce, and various Californian tribes, faced displacement, violent conflict, and population decline due to disease and settler encroachment. Canada in the early 19th century remained under British colonial administration. The provinces of Upper and Lower Canada, established in 1791, continued to experience population growth due to Loyalist migration from the United States, European immigration, and natural increase. Economic activity focused on agriculture, fur trade, timber production, and emerging industrial ventures. Administrative records detail the development of legislative assemblies, infrastructure projects, and colonial governance, as well as interactions with indigenous nations, including land cessions and treaty negotiations. Urbanization also increased in North America during this period. Cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Montreal, and Quebec City expanded in population, commerce, and infrastructure. Municipal records, port registries, and trade statistics document the growth of urban centers as hubs of finance, industry, shipping, and governance. Immigration contributed significantly to urban populations, with Irish, German, and British settlers arriving in large numbers in the 1830s and 1840s, supplementing labor for the industrial and transportation sectors. By the mid-19th century, North America had entered a period of interconnected economic and demographic expansion. The United States expanded territorially through purchases, annexations, and treaties, while Mexico grappled with internal governance challenges and northern frontier settlements. Canada continued under British administration, integrating Loyalist and European immigrants into agricultural and urban economies. Indigenous nations across the continent faced territorial loss, displacement, and integration into colonial and settler economic systems, documented extensively in treaty records, military reports, and settlement surveys. The economic transformation of this period was reflected in trade networks linking North America to Europe, the Caribbean, and Asia. Cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar exports from the southern United States were connected to European textile markets. Northern manufacturing and shipping facilitated the export of lumber, grain, and manufactured goods. Fur trade, mining, and agriculture expanded in Western territories, with trade networks documented through commercial ledgers, shipping manifests, and correspondence between merchants. The integration of transportation infrastructure, including canals, roads, and railroads, supported the growth of continental markets, facilitated migration, and strengthened the economic foundation of the United States and Canada. Population growth and demographic shifts were significant during this period. In the United States, the population increased from approximately 9.6 million in 1820 to over 31 million by 1860, including more than 4 million enslaved Africans. Mexico's population, including indigenous, mestizo, and European-descended groups, grew steadily, with settlements concentrated in central and northern regions. Canada's population increased through natural growth and immigration, reaching approximately 3.2 million by the 1850s. Indigenous populations continued to decline due to disease, displacement, and assimilation policies, although many maintained cultural continuity in reservations and remote territories. By 1860, North America had entered a period of intensified sectional and continental transformation. Territorial expansion, economic integration, demographic growth, and institutional development had established frameworks for the political, social, and economic systems of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. These developments were extensively documented through censuses, land surveys, treaties, military records, legislative acts, commercial reports, and personal accounts, providing a detailed and continuous record of the continent's development during the first half of the 19th century. The decade between 1860 and 1870 in North America was defined by profound political upheaval, military conflict, and institutional transformation, most notably through the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and the establishment of the Canadian Confederation, 1867. This period reshaped territorial boundaries, governance structures, economic systems, and social dynamics, creating enduring frameworks for both the United States and Canada while influencing neighboring regions, including Mexico. In the United States, sectional tensions have been escalating for decades, driven by disputes over slavery, westward expansion, states' rights, and federal authority. By 1860, the United States comprised 33 states, with a population of approximately 31 million, including over 4 million enslaved African Americans concentrated primarily in the southern states. Economic divergence between the industrialized North and the agrarian, slave-based South had intensified political conflict. The presidential election of 1860, which resulted in the victory of Abraham Lincoln, a candidate representing the anti-slavery Republican Party, acted as a catalyst for secession movements in southern states. Beginning in December 1860, South Carolina formally seceded from the Union, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These seceding states formed the Confederate States of America in February 1861, with Jefferson Davis inaugurated as president. Congressional records, state resolutions, and contemporaneous newspapers document the formal processes of secession, constitutional drafts, and the political rationale offered by Southern leaders. The conflict commenced in April 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Following the engagement, both Union and Confederate forces mobilized for a sustained conflict. The war involved multiple theaters, including the Eastern Theater, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, the Western Theater, Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, the Trans-Mississippi Theater, and coastal and naval operations. Key battles included Bull Run, 1861, Antietam, 1862, Gettysburg, 1863, and Vicksburg, 1863. Military records, troop rosters, casualty reports, and logistical documents provide detailed accounts of troop movements, strategies, and resource allocations. The Union strategy, documented in military correspondence, focused on blockading southern ports to restrict Confederate trade, controlling the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy, and conducting coordinated campaigns to capture strategic territories. The Confederacy relied on defensive operations, interior lines, and attempts to gain international recognition and support from Britain and France. Diplomatic correspondence indicates that European powers remained officially neutral, although Southern cotton exports influenced economic calculations abroad. Slavery played a central role in both the political rationale and the military aspects of the war. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, declared enslaved persons in Confederate-held territories free, altering the legal and social framework of the conflict. Military records indicate that by the end of the war, nearly 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army and Navy, contributing to military campaigns and providing manpower that influenced the outcome of key engagements. Economically, the war imposed substantial demands on both the North and South. The Union mobilized resources through taxation, war bonds, and industrial production. Northern factories produced arms, ammunition, textiles, and transportation equipment, while railroads facilitated troop movement and supply chains. Southern economies, heavily dependent on agriculture and enslaved labor, suffered from blockades, destruction of infrastructure, and shortages of essential goods. Contemporary accounts, including economic reports and personal correspondence, document the collapse of Confederate commerce, inflation, and the redirection of labor resources. Indigenous nations were affected indirectly by the Civil War. Many Native communities, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek, experienced internal divisions, with factions supporting either the Union or Confederacy. Treaties, correspondence, and military reports indicate that indigenous leaders navigated these allegiances to protect land and political interests, although post-war policies often disregarded these agreements, resulting in further land loss and displacement. The war concluded in April 1865 with the surrender of Confederate General Robert East Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Other Confederate forces surrendered shortly thereafter, signaling the collapse of the Confederacy. Presidential and military records document the sequence of surrenders, the treatment of Confederate forces, and the occupation of Southern territories by Union troops. Abraham Lincoln, assassinated on April 14, 1865, was succeeded by Andrew Johnson, whose administration would oversee the early stages of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, represented a systematic effort to reintegrate Southern states into the Union, enforce civil rights, and reconstruct social and political systems. Constitutional amendments played a central role. The 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, 1868, guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, 1870, prohibited voting discrimination based on race. Congressional records, state legislative documents, and judicial proceedings provide detailed accounts of the enactment, interpretation, and enforcement of these amendments. Reconstruction policies also included military governance in former Confederate states, the establishment of public education systems, and economic initiatives to facilitate recovery and integration. During the same decade, Canada underwent a significant political transformation with the Canadian Confederation of 1867. The Dominion of Canada was formally established on July 1, 1867, uniting the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia under a federal parliamentary system within the British Empire. Confederation documents, legislative records, and colonial correspondence detail the negotiation process, addressing issues such as taxation, representation, provincial autonomy, and defense. Subsequent provincial expansion incorporated Manitoba, 1870, British Columbia, 1871, and Prince Edward Island, 1873, creating mechanisms for governance, settlement, and resource management across vast northern territories. Canada's population in 1870 was approximately 3.5 million, concentrated in urban centers such as Montreal, Toronto, Quebec City, and Halifax, while rural settlements expanded in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. Economic activity focused on agriculture, timber, fur trade, and the early development of manufacturing. Transportation infrastructure, including railroads and ports, facilitated domestic and transatlantic commerce. Colonial records, census data, and commercial reports provide detailed insight into demographic growth, labor distribution, and trade networks during this period. Indigenous nations, including the Cree, Ojibwe, Mi'kmaq, and others, negotiated treaties with the Canadian government, establishing reserves and ceding lands while maintaining cultural and social autonomy in designated regions. In Mexico, the 1860s were marked by political instability, foreign intervention, and reform. Following internal conflicts between liberal and conservative factions, the country faced the French intervention, 1861 to 1867, during which Napoleon III installed Maximilian I as Emperor of Mexico. Military records, diplomatic correspondence, and governmental documents document battles, administrative policies, and territorial governance during this period. Liberal forces led by Benito Juárez resisted the foreign-installed monarchy, ultimately restoring the republic by 1867. Juárez implemented constitutional reforms emphasizing secular governance, centralization of authority, and modernization of civil institutions. Census data and administrative records document territorial administration, economic policies, and social programs during the Restoration period. Throughout the decade, North America experienced significant demographic, economic, and technological developments. The United States underwent population growth, reaching nearly 38 million by 1870, with continued regional differences in economic activity, social organization, and political alignment. Railroads expanded extensively, connecting eastern and western territories, facilitating migration, trade, and military logistics. Canada's rail networks and shipping infrastructure supported economic integration and settlement expansion, while Mexico undertook reconstruction and consolidation of civil authority following foreign intervention. Indigenous populations across the continent faced continued pressure from settler expansion, military campaigns, and government policies. In the United States, the aftermath of the Civil War and westward settlement intensified conflicts with Plains nations, including the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Military campaigns, treaties, and reservation policies during this period were extensively documented through government records, military reports, and indigenous accounts, detailing land cessions, forced relocations, and the negotiation of political and economic arrangements. In Canada, the establishment of reserves and negotiation of treaties formalized territorial relationships, although Indigenous populations retained significant cultural and social autonomy in northern and remote regions. Economically, the decade saw the consolidation of agricultural, industrial, and commercial systems across North America. The United States integrated Western territories into national markets, promoted mechanization in agriculture and manufacturing, and continued to develop financial and transportation institutions. Canada expanded agricultural settlement in Ontario and Quebec while developing timber, fur, and mining industries. Mexico focused on rebuilding post-intervention, establishing fiscal policies, infrastructure development, and economic integration between central and northern provinces. Commercial records, census data, and infrastructure documentation provide detailed evidence of these developments. Urbanization accelerated in both the United States and Canada during the 1860s. Cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Montreal, and Toronto expanded in population and industrial capacity. Urban records, including census data, property registers, and municipal reports, document the growth of housing, commercial facilities, public services, and transportation networks. Migration, both internal and international, contributed to labor supply and demographic diversification, with significant numbers of European immigrants arriving in northern urban centers, complementing domestic labor needs in agriculture, manufacturing, and infrastructure construction. By 1870, North America had experienced a decade of military, political, and institutional transformation. The United States had abolished slavery, preserved the Union, and established constitutional and legal frameworks for civil rights, while Canada had emerged as a federal dominion within the British Empire with governance structures supporting provincial autonomy and federal oversight. Mexico had restored republican governance following foreign intervention, consolidating political authority and modernizing civil institutions. Across the continent, Indigenous nations faced displacement, negotiated territorial arrangements, and navigated relationships with expanding settler societies, documenting the complex social, economic, and political interactions that characterized this period. The period from 1870 to 1920 marked a transformative era in North America, characterized by industrialization, urbanization, technological development, political consolidation, and significant social and demographic shifts. The United States, Canada, and Mexico each experienced distinctive developments, yet shared broader patterns of economic modernization, territorial integration, and state building. In the United States, the post-Civil War era continued the expansion of national infrastructure, industry, and urban settlements. Railroads, extending thousands of miles across the continent, connected eastern urban centers to newly settled western territories. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 facilitated the movement of goods, labor, and settlers, accelerating the integration of Western territories into the national economy. Census records indicate that by 1880, the U.S. population reached 50 million, including nearly 7 million African Americans concentrated primarily in the South. Urban populations grew rapidly, with cities such as New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston serving as centers of industry, commerce, and immigration. Industrialization intensified throughout the late 19th century. Factories producing steel, textiles, machinery, and consumer goods expanded in the Northeast and Midwest. Technological innovations, including the Bessemer process for steel production, mechanized textile machinery, and electrification, enhanced productivity. Corporate records, economic reports, and census data document the growth of industrial employment, capital investment, and urban labor markets. Mining industries in the West, including coal, silver, and gold extraction, supported both domestic markets and international trade. The expansion of railroads and industry coincided with increased immigration from Europe and Asia. Between 1870 and 1920, millions of immigrants arrived in the United States, including significant numbers from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, and China. Immigration records, naturalization documents, and port registries indicate that these populations settled primarily in urban centers, contributing to industrial labor, commercial enterprises, and demographic diversification. Chinese immigrants, initially concentrated in Western states, faced legal restrictions under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which limited labor and residency rights and influenced subsequent immigration policies. Indigenous nations continued to experience significant disruption and displacement. Federal policies sought to assimilate indigenous populations into American society, often through reservation systems, land allotments, and educational programs. The Dawes Act of 1887 authorized the division of tribal lands into individual allotments, with surplus lands sold to non-indigenous settlers. Government records, treaties, and administrative reports document the allocation of land, the displacement of indigenous communities, and the introduction of agricultural and vocational programs intended to integrate indigenous populations into the settler economy. Resistance to assimilation persisted in multiple regions, including the northern plains and southwestern United States, and military campaigns were occasionally employed to enforce policy objectives. In Mexico, the period was characterized by the long rule of Porfirio Diaz, who governed as president from 1876 to 1911, with a brief interruption in 1880 to 1884. Diaz implemented policies aimed at centralizing authority, modernizing infrastructure, and fostering economic development. Railroads expanded across northern, central, and southern regions, connecting Mexico City to regional centers, ports, and northern border towns. Industrialization progressed with the development of mining, textile, and manufacturing enterprises. Land tenure policies, including the concentration of property in haciendas, affected indigenous and peasant populations, leading to social stratification and rural displacement. Government reports, census data, and economic records document the scope of industrial expansion, foreign investment, and the consolidation of political power during this period. Political and social tensions in Mexico culminated in the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, which sought to overthrow the Diaz regime and implement reforms addressing land ownership, labor rights, and political representation. Early revolutionary activity involved regional uprisings led by figures such as Francisco I. Madero, Emiliano Zapata, and Pancho Villa. Madero's success in ousting Diaz in 1911 initiated a period of constitutional reform, social conflict, and military campaigns. The promulgation of the Mexican Constitution of 1917 established frameworks for land redistribution, labor rights, and civil liberties, including provisions for indigenous communities. Records of battles, land reform policies, and governance structures provide detailed evidence of political change and social reorganization during this decade-long revolutionary period. Canada experienced parallel processes of industrialization, population growth, and political consolidation. Following the Confederation of 1867, the Dominion of Canada expanded westward, incorporating Manitoba, 1870, British Columbia, 1871, and Prince Edward Island, 1873, with negotiations for territorial inclusion continuing throughout the late 19th century. The federal government implemented policies to support settlement, resource exploitation, and transportation infrastructure, including the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885. Census records indicate rapid population growth, with European immigrants from Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe settling in urban and rural areas. Economic activity focused on agriculture, timber, mining, and early manufacturing, with commercial and municipal records documenting production volumes, labor distribution, and trade networks. Urbanization across North America accelerated during this period. In the United States, industrial cities experienced rapid expansion in population and infrastructure. Housing developments, sanitation systems, and municipal governance adapted to growing urban densities. Labor movements emerged in response to industrial working conditions, advocating for wages, hours, and safety regulations. Strikes, union formation, and labor disputes were extensively recorded in municipal and state documents, illustrating the evolving relationship between labor, industry, and government. Canada and Mexico also witnessed urban growth, with municipal records, census data, and infrastructure reports documenting the expansion of port facilities, transport systems, and urban economies. Technological developments further facilitated economic and social transformation. The introduction of the telegraph, electrical power, and mechanized production improved communication, transportation, and industrial capacity. In agriculture, mechanized plows, threshing machines, and irrigation techniques increased productivity, supporting settlement and export-oriented economies. Government records, technical manuals, and industrial reports document the deployment, adoption, and impact of these technologies across North America. Education and intellectual life expanded during this period. Universities, secondary schools, and vocational institutions developed across urban and rural areas, providing formal instruction in technical, scientific, and classical disciplines. Records indicate enrollment growth, curriculum development, and the establishment of professional associations, reflecting broader societal investment in literacy, technical expertise, and civic participation. Newspapers, journals, and pamphlets provided platforms for public discourse on economic, political, and social developments, creating a contemporaneous record of thought and policy across the continent. Immigration and migration patterns influenced demographic composition, labor markets, and cultural integration. In the United States, immigrants settled primarily in northeastern and midwestern urban centers, while internal migration, particularly westward, distributed populations across the Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, and Pacific Coast. Canada similarly received European settlers, whose settlement facilitated agricultural production, resource extraction, and urban growth. Mexico experienced both internal migration from central to northern regions and cross-border movements in response to economic opportunities and revolutionary disruptions. Population records, census data, and immigration registries document these patterns, including age, occupation, and geographic distribution. Relations with indigenous populations remained a critical factor in settlement and expansion. In the United States, military campaigns in the Plains and Southwest sought to suppress resistance to settler expansion. Treaties, land cessions, and forced relocation policies were extensively recorded, detailing the allocation of reservations, compensation, and attempts at cultural assimilation through educational and vocational programs. Canada negotiated treaties with Indigenous nations to facilitate settlement and resource exploitation while establishing reserves and regulating governance. Mexico's northern and southern indigenous populations faced land concentration under hacienda systems, with some integration into regional economies and occasional localized resistance. By 1920, North America had entered a period of extensive industrial, political, and demographic consolidation. The United States had expanded infrastructure, established industrial and agricultural productivity, and absorbed large immigrant populations. Canada had completed territorial expansion, integrated new provinces, and developed national transportation and economic networks. Mexico had experienced political revolution, constitutional reform, and industrial and agricultural modernization. Across the continent, indigenous nations faced continued challenges related to land, autonomy, and cultural preservation, while settler and immigrant populations reshaped social, economic, and political landscapes. Economic systems across North America became increasingly interconnected. The United States and Canada expanded trade in natural resources, manufactured goods, and agricultural products. Port activity, rail transport, and internal markets facilitated continental integration, while Mexico's post-revolutionary policies promoted domestic production and regional trade. Government reports, commercial ledgers, and census data document the scale, scope, and organization of these economies, reflecting regional specialization, labor distribution, and technological adoption. Political developments reinforced institutional stability. In the United States, presidential administrations oversaw regulatory policies, foreign diplomacy, and domestic expansion, with legislative and judicial frameworks maintaining federal and state authority. Canada's parliamentary system consolidated federal-provincial relations, addressing representation, taxation, and governance. Mexico implemented constitutional structures to codify civil, economic, and political rights, while balancing federal and state authority. Legislative records, legal codes, and administrative correspondence provide detailed evidence of governance structures and policy implementation across North America. By the close of this period, North America had achieved substantial territorial consolidation, industrial development, and demographic expansion. Infrastructure, economic networks, and political institutions were firmly established, supporting continued growth and integration. Documentation from censuses, treaties, municipal and federal records, industrial reports, and migration registries provides a comprehensive and continuous account of the continent's transformation between 1870 and 1920. The period from 1920 to 1945 in North America encompassed transformative economic, social, and political developments, including the post-World War I adjustments, the Great Depression, interwar political changes, and World War II mobilization. These decades reshaped the United States, Canada, and Mexico, producing enduring institutional, economic, and demographic consequences. In the United States, the early 1920s were marked by post-war economic adjustments, technological innovation, and cultural change. Industrial production continued to expand, supported by mass production techniques, mechanized agriculture, and advancements in consumer goods manufacturing. The automotive industry, led by Ford and General Motors, introduced assembly line methods that increased efficiency and reduced costs, facilitating widespread automobile ownership. Census and industrial production data indicate significant growth in urban populations and manufacturing output, while agricultural regions experienced mixed results due to price fluctuations and overproduction following World War I. The Roaring Twenties also saw significant social and cultural changes. Urban centers expanded rapidly, and population shifts from rural to urban areas increased. Immigration continued, though legislation such as the Immigration Act of 1924 imposed quotas that significantly limited arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe. African American migration from the South to northern cities, known as the Great Migration, contributed to demographic shifts in cities including Chicago, New York, Detroit, and Philadelphia, affecting labor markets, cultural institutions, and municipal planning. Contemporary demographic data, municipal records, and employment reports provide detailed accounts of these population changes and economic patterns. The stock market collapse of October 1929 initiated the Great Depression, a period of severe economic contraction affecting the United States, Canada, and Mexico. In the United States, industrial output fell by nearly 50% by 1933, while unemployment reached approximately 25% of the labor force. Agricultural prices collapsed, impacting farmers across the Midwest and South. Contemporary economic reports, banking records, and labor statistics document the scale of the crisis, including bank failures, wage reductions, and widespread business closures. The federal government responded with policy measures under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, 1933 to 1939, including the establishment of agencies such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, Works Progress Administration, WPA, and Social Security Administration, SSA. Legislative records and agency reports provide quantitative data on employment, public works projects, and social welfare programs. Canada experienced parallel economic disruption during the Depression. Industrial production declined, particularly in manufacturing centers in Ontario. In Quebec, while export-dependent resource sectors, including timber, wheat, and minerals, faced international market contraction, unemployment rose, and social unrest increased in urban areas. The federal government implemented relief programs, public works projects, and agricultural assistance measures to mitigate economic hardship. Provincial governments also enacted measures addressing social services, public health, and labor disputes. documented in administrative records, census data, and economic reports. Mexico during the interwar period experienced political consolidation following the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. President Alvaro Obregón, 1920 to 1924, and his successors, including Plutarco Elias Calles, implemented land reforms, labor policies, and education initiatives under the Mexican Constitution of 1917. Land redistribution through the ejido system provided collective land holdings for rural communities, particularly indigenous and peasant populations. Agricultural reports, government decrees, and land surveys document the implementation, scale, and economic impact of these reforms. Industrial development was limited but included expansion in mining, oil extraction, and urban manufacturing, with government and corporate records detailing production volumes, labor allocation, and trade. The 1930s also witnessed growing political centralization in Mexico as the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, emerged from the consolidation of revolutionary factions. Policies emphasized national sovereignty, regulation of foreign investment, and social programs for workers and rural populations. Legislative documents, administrative correspondence, and economic statistics provide insight into the consolidation of governance, the development of state-led economic initiatives, and the management of social policies. During the late 1930s, North America entered the global conflict of World War II, 1939 to 1945. The United States initially maintained neutrality, enacting legislation such as the Neutrality Acts, 1935 to 1939, to limit involvement in European conflicts. Canadian and Mexican governments pursued parallel measures, with Canada maintaining ties to Britain as a member of the Commonwealth and Mexico focusing on domestic stability. The outbreak of war in Europe and subsequent Japanese expansion in Asia created economic and strategic pressures across the continent. Military and diplomatic correspondence document preparation measures, defense planning, and international coordination. The United States entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, initiating full-scale mobilization. Military enlistment increased, reaching over 12 million by 1945, and the federal government directed economic resources toward war production. Industrial sectors, including steel, aircraft, shipbuilding, and munitions, expanded rapidly, supported by government contracts, labor organizations, and technological innovation. Economic data, labor statistics, and industrial reports provide detailed accounts of production output, workforce composition, and regional industrial concentration. Canada declared war on Germany on September 10, 1939, engaging in both European and Atlantic campaigns. Canadian forces participated in the Battle of the Atlantic, the invasion of Italy, and the liberation of Northwest Europe. Military records, operational reports, and recruitment statistics document troop deployment, casualties, and logistical operations. Domestic economic mobilization included expansion of manufacturing, transportation infrastructure, and agricultural production to support both domestic needs and allied military efforts. Employment records, production reports, and census data provide quantitative insight into industrial and agricultural contributions to the war effort. Mexico maintained initial neutrality but contributed to Allied efforts through economic and strategic support. Following the Mexican declaration of war in 1942, After German submarine attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico, Mexico provided Escuadron 201, a fighter squadron deployed to the Pacific Theater in the Philippines. Industrial and agricultural production increased to support both domestic needs and Allied supply chains, with labor statistics, government reports, and military records detailing participation, output, and coordination with the United States. The war years produced profound social and economic transformations. In the United States, women entered the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, exemplified by programs such as Rosie the Riveter, contributing to munitions production, manufacturing, and transportation. Labor unions negotiated wage adjustments, working conditions, and benefits under wartime regulations. Census data, labor reports, and governmental agency records document these demographic and occupational shifts. Post-war planning, including the creation of the G.I. Bill in 1944, anticipated the reintegration of returning military personnel, supporting education, homeownership, and workforce reinsertion. Canada similarly experienced social transformation. Women entered industrial and agricultural labor, while training programs prepared young men and women for wartime occupations. Urban centers expanded to accommodate workforce influx, and federal programs addressed housing, health, and labor regulation. Indigenous populations participated in both military and industrial capacities, with records detailing enlistment, employment, and social initiatives. Technological innovation accelerated during this period. Advancements in aviation, mechanized agriculture, communications, and industrial production enhanced military and civilian capacities. The development of radar, radio communication, mechanized vehicles, and aircraft influenced both strategic operations and economic productivity. Industrial and military reports document research, production, deployment, and integration of these technologies across North American industries and armed forces. The economic impact of war mobilization in North America was profound. In the United States, gross national product increased substantially, unemployment fell to near zero, and industrial capacity expanded to support both domestic and Allied needs. Canada experienced a similar increase in production, with industrial and agricultural sectors contributing to both national and Allied supply chains. Mexico's economic output increased modestly, reflecting government coordination with U.S. supply programs, industrial expansion in urban centers, and agricultural production for domestic and Allied consumption. Statistical reports, economic analyses, and government records provide detailed documentation of these changes. Demographic changes during this period were significant. Migration patterns shifted due to industrial labor demands, military service, and wartime production needs. The Great Migration of African Americans to northern industrial centers continued, altering urban demographics, labor distribution, and social composition. Canadian and Mexican urban centers experienced similar internal migration patterns, driven by labor requirements, industrial expansion, and post-war reconstruction planning. Census records, municipal reports, and employment data provide quantitative insight into these demographic shifts. By 1945, North America had undergone a comprehensive military, economic, and social transformation. The United States emerged as a dominant industrial and military power, with extensive mobilization infrastructure, technological capacity, and institutional organization. Canada consolidated its economic and military contribution to Allied operations, integrating industrial and agricultural production into a continental framework. Mexico restored political stability, expanded industrial capacity, and participated directly in Allied military operations. Across the continent, population shifts, industrialization, and technological development laid the groundwork for post-war economic integration and continued global engagement. The period from 1945 to 1991 in North America was characterized by geopolitical tension, economic transformation, technological advancement, and significant social change. Following the conclusion of World War II, the United States and Canada emerged as central actors in global politics, aligning with Western powers during the Cold War, while Mexico focused on domestic modernization, political consolidation, and regional economic integration. In the United States, the immediate post-war period involved economic readjustment from a wartime to a peacetime economy. Industrial output, previously concentrated on military production, transitioned to consumer goods, housing, and infrastructure. The G.I. Bill of 1944 facilitated the education and homeownership of returning veterans, resulting in a surge of college enrollment and suburban development. Census data from the 1950s indicate a rapid increase in suburban population growth, with areas such as Levittown, New York, exemplifying standardized residential construction and planned community development. Industrial production continued to expand, with automobile manufacturing, consumer appliances, and electronics supporting economic growth. Employment data from the era indicate near full employment by the early 1950s, accompanied by rising real wages and increased household consumption. The Cold War fundamentally shaped U.S. foreign and domestic policy. Internationally, the United States assumed a leadership role in establishing multilateral institutions, including the United Nations, 1945, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, 1945, and the World Bank, 1945. The U.S. adopted containment policies aimed at limiting Soviet influence, formalized through military alliances such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, 1949. The Marshall Plan, 1948 to 1952, provided financial aid to Western Europe, facilitating reconstruction and strengthening transatlantic political alignment. Diplomatic correspondence, military planning documents, and congressional records provide detailed accounts of policy development, implementation, and strategic priorities. Domestically, the United States confronted social and political challenges related to race, civil rights, and indigenous populations. The civil rights movement, spanning the 1950s and 1960s, addressed racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic inequality. Landmark legislation included the Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibiting discrimination in employment, public accommodations, and education, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, enforcing voting protections for African Americans. Legal records, congressional proceedings, and Supreme Court decisions, such as Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, document the progression of civil rights protections and the legal dismantling of institutionalized segregation. Indigenous rights and land claims were also significant issues. In the United States, federal policies shifted from relocation and assimilation toward recognition of tribal sovereignty and land restitution. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, 1975, authorized tribal control over education, healthcare, and governance. Federal and tribal records document negotiations, land settlements, and legal frameworks supporting Indigenous self-determination. Canada, during the Cold War, maintained close alignment with the United States through military, economic, and political cooperation, while preserving distinct national institutions. Canadian participation in NATO and the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, 1958, exemplified military collaboration in continental defense. Domestically, Canada experienced economic growth, driven by industrial expansion, resource extraction, and trade integration. Urban centers such as Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver expanded, supported by immigration policies, infrastructure development, and employment opportunities. Immigration acts in 1967 and subsequent policies facilitated increased arrivals from Asia, Europe, and the Caribbean, contributing to demographic diversification and urban labor markets. Social policy development in Canada emphasized universal health care, education, and welfare. The introduction of the Canada Pension Plan, 1965, and federal health care programs expanded social security and public services. Census data, legislative records, and administrative reports provide quantitative evidence of population growth, employment, and social program implementation. Indigenous populations in Canada negotiated land claims and treaty settlements, formalizing reserve allocations and maintaining cultural and political autonomy within federal and provincial frameworks. Mexico during the Cold War underwent political consolidation under the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, which maintained continuous governance from 1946 to the early 1990s. Economic policy emphasized import substitution, industrialization, infrastructure development, and agricultural modernization. The government invested in energy, transportation, and urban industrial centers, while implementing social programs in health and education. Political control was maintained through centralized institutions, electoral mechanisms, and corporatist organizations representing labor, peasant, and professional groups. Administrative records, census data, and economic reports document the scope and outcomes of these policies. The 1960s and 1970s in North America saw the expansion of technological innovation and scientific advancement. In the United States, the space program, exemplified by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, established 1958, led to the launch of satellites, human spaceflight, and the Apollo moon missions. Military research, telecommunications, computing, and nuclear technology advanced concurrently, supporting both national defense and civilian applications. Canada developed aerospace research programs, computing initiatives, and energy infrastructure, including hydroelectric and nuclear power, to support industrial and urban expansion. Mexico invested selectively in infrastructure modernization, including dams, transportation networks, and urban electrification, reflecting priorities in regional economic development. Government, scientific agency, and industrial records provide detailed documentation of research, innovation, and technology deployment. Economic integration across North America increased during the Cold War. The United States and Canada developed closely linked trade networks, facilitated by transportation infrastructure, standardized regulatory frameworks, and complementary industrial capacities. Mexico's economy became increasingly oriented toward domestic industrial production and regional trade, with growing cross-border commerce with the United States. Statistical records, trade reports, and industrial data document output, commodity flows, and labor market adjustments across sectors. Demographic trends reflected population growth, urbanization, and migration. In the United States, suburbanization accelerated post-World War II, facilitated by highway construction, housing programs, and increased automobile ownership. Urban planning, municipal records, and census data indicate substantial population redistribution from central cities to suburban municipalities. Canada experienced similar patterns in metropolitan areas, including Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, while immigration from Europe, Asia, and the Caribbean reshaped labor and cultural demographics. Mexico's population growth is concentrated in urban centers, including Mexico City, Monterrey, and Guadalajara, alongside rural to urban migration for industrial and commercial employment. Census records and municipal reports provide detailed quantitative evidence of these trends. Cultural and educational developments paralleled economic and demographic changes. In the United States, the expansion of public education, higher education institutions, and vocational training supported workforce development. Canada and Mexico also expanded educational access, establishing universities, technical institutes, and public school networks. Enrollment statistics, administrative reports, and institutional records detail the growth of educational infrastructure, professional training, and public access to literacy and technical education. The late Cold War era in the 1970s and 1980s saw shifts in political, economic, and social dynamics. In the United States, economic restructuring included transitions from manufacturing to service industries, expansion of information technology, and adjustments to energy crises. Labor market reports, industrial records, and economic analyses provide detailed accounts of employment shifts, productivity changes, and regional economic variation. Canada's economy diversified, emphasizing natural resources, manufacturing, and service sectors, while government policies addressed inflation, unemployment, and social program sustainability. Mexico faced economic challenges, including debt crises, currency devaluation, and pressures to liberalize trade and industry, reflected in government budgets, fiscal reports, and trade statistics. Environmental and indigenous issues became increasingly prominent in policy and legal frameworks. In the United States, environmental legislation, including the Clean Air Act, 1970, and Clean Water Act, 1972, established regulatory standards for pollution control. Indigenous movements advocated for land claims, resource management, and cultural preservation, resulting in treaties, legal recognition, and institutional representation. Canada enacted parallel environmental and indigenous policies, including recognition of treaty rights, land claim settlements, and resource management frameworks. Mexico incorporated environmental considerations into development planning, though challenges in enforcement and resource allocation persisted. Government records, environmental studies, and legal documents provide detailed evidence of these developments. The conclusion of the Cold War era, marked by the late 1980s and early 1990s, saw the United States emerge as a dominant global economic and military power. Canada maintained a high-income economy with international trade integration and continued alignment with Western defense frameworks. Mexico pursued economic liberalization, culminating in negotiations that would later lead to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, 1994. Industrial, trade, and economic records document these trends, reflecting long-term integration, market development, and policy coordination across North America. Technological and cultural developments during this period were extensive. The United States led advancements in computing, telecommunications, aerospace, and energy technology. Canada contributed to aerospace research, telecommunications infrastructure, and natural resource exploitation. Mexico expanded industrial centers, transportation networks, and urban electrification, supporting domestic and regional economic activity. Statistical reports, technical documentation, and government planning records provide detailed evidence of the scope and impact of technological development. By 1991, North America had established integrated economic systems, extensive infrastructure, and robust political institutions. The continent's population distribution, industrial capacity, and technological development reflected sustained growth over nearly 5 decades of Cold War influence. Indigenous, minority, and immigrant populations continued to negotiate legal recognition, cultural preservation, and political representation, forming part of the evolving social and institutional landscape. Economic, demographic, legislative, and industrial records from this period provide comprehensive documentation of North America's structural and functional transformations during the Cold War era. In the United States, the early 1990s were marked by economic adjustment following a mild recession in 1990 to 1991. Industrial sectors transitioned further toward information technology, telecommunications, finance, and service-based economies. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, implemented in 1994, facilitated trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, creating integrated supply chains, increasing cross-border commerce, and promoting investment. Trade statistics from this period indicate substantial growth in goods and services exchanged, including automotive, agricultural, and technology sectors. Political developments included the administration of President Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001, which focused on economic expansion, fiscal policy, and domestic reform. Legislative measures addressed welfare reform, healthcare policy, and technological investment, while foreign policy emphasized trade expansion, NATO engagement, and international diplomacy. Congressional records, policy documents, and economic reports detail these initiatives, reflecting both legislative priorities and economic outcomes. Canada during this period pursued economic stabilization, social program development, and technological advancement. The federal government emphasized free trade agreements, including NAFTA, along with policies supporting industrial diversification, energy development, and urban infrastructure. Demographic shifts were influenced by immigration policies introduced in the 1990s, allowing increased arrivals from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Census and municipal data document population growth, urban expansion, and labor market adjustments, with metropolitan regions such as Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal expanding both economically and socially. Mexico experienced political reform and economic liberalization following decades of PRI dominance. The government implemented structural adjustments aimed at liberalizing trade, privatizing state-owned enterprises, and attracting foreign investment. NAFTA's implementation facilitated integration into regional and global markets, particularly in manufacturing, automotive, and agricultural sectors. Industrial reports, trade data, and economic analyses document productivity increases, export growth, and shifts in labor markets during this period. Politically, Mexico transitioned toward greater electoral competition, culminating in the election of Vicente Fox of the National Action Party, PAN, in 2000, marking the first non-PRI presidential administration in 71 years. Electoral records, government documents, and legislative archives detail this political transition and subsequent policy initiatives. Technological development across North America accelerated rapidly in this era. The United States led the proliferation of personal computing, internet technologies, telecommunications infrastructure, and software development. Companies in Silicon Valley, Boston, and other technological hubs contributed to global technological leadership. Canada expanded its technology sector in information technology, communications, aerospace, and energy management, while Mexico developed industrial and technological capacities to support manufacturing, telecommunications, and urban infrastructure. Corporate records, technical documentation, and government reports provide evidence of investment, innovation, and technological deployment across sectors. Urbanization and demographic change continued throughout the continent. In the United States, suburban expansion persisted, though metropolitan centers experienced reinvestment and urban revitalization projects. Immigration contributed significantly to population growth, with Latin American, Asian, and African communities expanding urban labor markets, cultural institutions, and educational systems. Canada's immigration policies led to significant diversification, contributing to multicultural policy frameworks and urban labor force growth. Mexico's internal migration favored urban centers, particularly Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey, reflecting industrial employment opportunities, service sector expansion, and education access. Population data, census reports, and municipal records provide quantitative evidence of these trends. Social movements in North America addressed inequality, civil rights, environmental concerns, and indigenous sovereignty. In the United States, indigenous nations pursued legal recognition, land settlements, and self-governance initiatives, resulting in treaties, administrative frameworks, and economic development programs. Civil rights, gender equality, and labor movements continued to influence policy, with legislative measures, judicial decisions, and administrative programs documenting changes in employment, education, and social participation. Canada formalized Indigenous land claim settlements, negotiated self-governance agreements, and implemented policies supporting cultural preservation. Mexico's indigenous populations engaged in political activism, legal claims, and cultural recognition initiatives, supported by constitutional provisions and regional development programs. Legal records, government reports, and indigenous organizational documentation provide detailed evidence of these developments. Economic development in the United States during this period included sustained growth in service industries, technology, finance, and manufacturing. The late 1990s experienced robust economic expansion, characterized by rising GDP, low unemployment, and increased consumer spending. The early 2000s saw periods of economic contraction, including the 2001 recession and the 2008 financial crisis, precipitated by declines in housing markets, credit markets, and global economic instability. Federal Reserve reports, economic analyses, and industry records document production, employment, and financial trends during these cycles. Canada's economy similarly experienced fluctuations related to global markets, resource prices, and manufacturing output. Trade agreements, monetary policy, and fiscal management contributed to stabilization, while social programs continued to support healthcare, education, and public welfare. Industrial and agricultural data indicate adaptation to international market demands, technological modernization, and labor force reorganization. Mexico's economy, following the 1994 peso crisis, implemented stabilization programs, liberalized trade, and increased foreign direct investment, particularly in manufacturing, energy, and services. Economic statistics, trade records, and fiscal reports provide quantitative documentation of growth, stabilization, and integration within the continental economy. North America's political landscape during this period reflected both continuity and transformation. The United States alternated between Democratic and Republican administrations, influencing fiscal policy, foreign affairs, and social programs. Canada maintained parliamentary governance, with policy continuity in economic management, social services, and environmental regulation. Mexico pursued democratic consolidation, electoral reform, and policy initiatives to support economic liberalization and social development. Legislative records, government reports, and election data document these political processes, highlighting shifts in governance, policy priorities, and institutional development. Technological innovation further influenced social, economic, and industrial sectors. The proliferation of personal computing, mobile communications, and the internet transformed commerce, education, and governance. Telecommunication networks expanded, enabling continental and global connectivity, while industrial automation increased manufacturing efficiency. Aerospace development, energy technologies, and transportation infrastructure contributed to economic productivity and regional integration. Corporate records, technical reports, and government documentation provide comprehensive accounts of technological adoption, deployment, and impact. Environmental and energy policies became increasingly significant. The United States implemented legislation addressing air and water quality, energy efficiency, and climate monitoring. Canada developed resource management strategies, including hydroelectric, petroleum, and natural gas production, alongside environmental protection measures. Mexico incorporated environmental planning into urban development, industrial operations, and energy infrastructure, though challenges in enforcement persisted. Government records, technical assessments, and environmental monitoring reports provide quantitative evidence of policy implementation and outcomes. International engagement shaped North America's economic, political, and security frameworks. The United States led initiatives in trade agreements, global diplomacy, and security partnerships, including NATO operations, economic partnerships, and military cooperation. Canada coordinated closely with the United States and other allies, contributing to continental defense, peacekeeping, and economic integration. Mexico's participation in trade agreements, diplomatic initiatives, and regional forums supported both domestic economic growth and continental cooperation. Trade records, diplomatic correspondence, and multilateral agreements provide detailed evidence of continental and global engagement. By the 2010s, North America had achieved extensive economic integration, technological advancement, and political consolidation. The implementation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, 2020, updated NAFTA provisions, modernizing trade rules, labor standards, and environmental protections. Industrial production, service sector expansion, and digital economies drove continued economic growth. Demographic records indicate sustained urbanization, migration, and labor diversification, with multicultural populations shaping social and economic patterns. Educational institutions, labor statistics, and census data provide quantitative support for these trends. Social movements continued to influence policy, governance, and cultural recognition. Indigenous sovereignty, land claims, and cultural preservation advanced through legal and administrative channels in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Civil rights, gender equality, labor rights, and environmental advocacy shaped legislative and judicial action, reflecting sustained societal engagement. Legal records, administrative documentation, and census data provide evidence of the impact and outcomes of these movements. Technological innovation remained a central factor in economic and social transformation. Digital communication, computing, artificial intelligence, renewable energy technologies, and aerospace development enhanced productivity, research capacity, and global influence. North American nations invested in infrastructure, research and development, and education to support continued technological leadership. Corporate reports, government records, and technical assessments document research initiatives, investment levels, and applications across industrial, academic, and governmental sectors. As of the present, North America continues to function as a region of economic integration, political stability, and technological advancement. The United States maintains global leadership in industry, finance, and military capability, while Canada sustains high-income economic structures, social programs, and environmental policies. Mexico continues modernization efforts, democratic consolidation, and regional economic integration. Across the continent, demographic diversification, urbanization, technological development, and social policy evolution define contemporary North America. Census data, economic reports, government records, and industrial statistics provide comprehensive documentation of these trends.